Mount Valley was one of those American towns where everyone knew each other, and the biggest event of the week was the opening of a new cafe or the replacement of a traffic light on the main street. Located in the foothills of Colorado, the town lived a quiet life, surrounded by majestic cliffs and coniferous forests. The population barely exceeded 8,000, and most of them worked either in tourism or construction, serving a steady stream of vacationers seeking mountain trails and picturesque views. Winston Haynes woke up on Thursday morning with the same heavy feeling in his chest that had haunted him for the past 3 months. The gray dawn light seeped through the thin curtains, illuminating the simple bedroom in their house on Maple Street. Winston had built the house himself 17 years ago when his construction company, Haynes Construction, was thriving, and the future seemed bright. Sabrina was already up. He could hear sounds coming from the kitchen, the hiss of the coffee maker, the clatter of dishes. Over the past 6 months, their morning rituals had become mechanical, devoid of the warmth that had once bound their 18-year marriage. Winston rubbed his face with his hands, feeling his stubble, and forced himself to get up. In the bathroom mirror, a tired, middle-aged man stared back at him. The gray hair at his temples had become more noticeable, and the wrinkles around his eyes had deepened. At 42, he felt much older. The construction business in a small town required a constant struggle for every contract, and over the past 2 years, that struggle had become increasingly hopeless. Going downstairs, Winston found Sabrina at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and some documents. She was already dressed for work at the bank, a strict dark suit, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. At 38, Sabrina had retained her attractiveness, but their relationship had cooled so much that Winston could hardly remember the last time he had really looked at her. "Morning," he muttered, pouring himself some coffee. "I need to talk to you," Sabrina said, without looking up from her papers. "Tonight, after work." Something in her tone made Winston wary. About what? Everything. She finally looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw a determination that did not bode well. About us, about the house, about the future. Winston felt his stomach clench. They had been dancing around this conversation for months, but both had avoided saying the words that would make their problems real. "Sabrina, I know times are tough right now, but times have been tough for 2 years, Winston." Her voice remained even, businesslike. "I can't live in limbo any longer." She gathered her papers, stood up, and headed for the door. She stopped at the door without turning around. "I've talked to a lawyer." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Winston alone with his coffee, which suddenly tasted as bitter as wormwood. The Haynes construction office was located in a small building on the outskirts of town, next to a building materials warehouse. Winston had once been proud of this place, a modest but successful business that he had built from scratch. Now it seemed to him a reminder of the collapse of all his hopes. Maria Gonzalez, his secretary, and virtually his only permanent employee, greeted him with a stack of bills. "The bank called again," she said, avoiding his gaze, "and the cement supplier." Winston nodded as he walked into his office. On the desk lay documents for the only major project he had left, the renovation of an old church on the east side of town. The $80,000 contract had seemed like a lifeline 3 months ago, but now he realized that even that money would only be enough to pay off his debts, leaving him with nothing to live on. The phone rang. The number was familiar. James Rivera, his best friend from college, and the only person who knew the true extent of his financial problems. "Hi, Jim." "Win, how are you? You sound like you've been hit by a truck." "Pretty much." Winston leaned back in his chair. "Sabrina mentioned a lawyer." There was a few seconds of silence on the other end of the line. "Damn, I thought you'd find a way after all." "Find a way to do what? Pretend everything's fine until the house gets taken away for debt?" Winston felt a note of desperation creep into his voice. "Jim, I don't know what to do. If she files for divorce, she'll get half of everything, James finished, including the house. The house is all I have. If it gets sold. Winston fell silent, unable to voice what that prospect meant. Listen, maybe we should meet up, talk about everything calmly? Yes, I suppose so. I'll finish up here and come over. The Deerhorn Bar was a typical small-town establishment. Wood paneling, taxidermy on the walls, the smell of beer and grilled meat. It was quiet on Thursday evening, which suited Winston just fine. James was already waiting for him in a corner booth, a mug of beer in front of him. James Rivera worked as an insurance agent and made a good living serving the needs of the local population and the tourist business. He was one of the few who did not judge Winston for his failures, perhaps because he himself had gone through a divorce 5 years ago. How did the conversation with Sabrina go? James asked when Winston sat down opposite him. There was no conversation. She just stated the facts. Winston ordered a whiskey. Jim, I can't go through with the divorce. Not now. Not when everything is already falling apart. Maybe it's for the best? You know, a clean slate. A clean slate of what? I have no money, no prospects, and debts up to my neck. Winston downed his drink. And she'll get half the house, half the business, what's left of it. James was silent for a moment, twirling the mug in his hands. You know, as an insurance agent, I constantly deal with situations where people receive money after tragic events. His voice became cautious. I remember you and Sabrina have a pretty large life insurance policy. Winston looked at him in confusion. So? Nothing. Just that sometimes life takes unexpected turns. Jim, what are you talking about? Nothing in particular. James raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. Just that sometimes problems solve themselves in ways we don't expect. Something in his friend's tone made Winston look at him more closely, but James was already changing the subject. At home, Winston found Sabrina in the living room with her laptop and some documents. She looked up when he entered, and her gaze was as businesslike as it had been that morning. Sit down, she said. We need to have a serious talk. Winston sank into the armchair opposite the sofa, feeling like a defendant awaiting sentencing. I don't want to live in this marriage anymore, Sabrina began without preamble. For the last 2 years, we've been living as roommates, not as spouses. Your business is falling apart. You're constantly gloomy. We hardly talk. Sabrina, I can fix everything. No, Winston, you can't. Her voice remained calm but firm. I've filed for divorce. The lawyer says it will take several months. And you want the house. I want a fair division of property. The house is our joint property. Winston felt a wave of despair and anger rise within him. I built this house with my own hands, every board, every nail. With the money we earned together. With the loan we took out together. Sabrina closed her laptop. I don't want to ruin you, Winston. But I have a right to half of what we've built over the past 18 years. And what will I have left? The same as me, the opportunity to start over. They sat in silence. Between them stretched the chasm of 18 years of life together, which suddenly turned out to be an illusion. I'll sleep in the guest bedroom, Sabrina finally said, until we settle all the formalities. She got up and headed for the stairs, leaving Winston alone with the divorce papers and the fragments of what had once been called a family. Sitting in the empty living room, Winston thought about the future for the first time in a long time, not in terms of construction contracts or loan payments. He thought about how, at 42, he might be left with nothing, about how the woman he had lived with for almost 2 decades had become a stranger, ready to take half of his world. James's words about the unexpected twists and turns of life, about problems that sometimes resolve themselves, echoed in his head. Winston wasn't sure he understood their meaning back then, in the bar, but now, in the silence of his ruined home, those words took on a new, disturbing meaning. Friday began with a phone call from the bank. The credit manager politely but insistently reminded him of the overdue payment on the corporate loan. Winston turned off the phone and stared out the window of his office at the church construction site, where workers were laying a new roof. Thoughts of divorce had kept him awake all night. Sabrina was right. They had indeed become strangers. But the fairness of her demands did not make them any less devastating for him. The house on Maple Street was not just a piece of real estate. It was his whole life, embodied in wood and stone. Around noon, the phone rang. James. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Terrible," Winston replied honestly. "The bank calls every day. Sabrina has stopped talking to me, and the workers at the church are starting to ask questions about the delay in their pay." "Listen, remember we talked about insurance policies yesterday?" Winston frowned. "I remember. So what?" "I checked your documents in the database." James's voice took on a cautious tone. "Sabrina has pretty serious coverage." "How serious?" $400,000. The policy was taken out 5 years ago when things were going better for you. Winston felt something tighten in his chest. $400,000. An amount that would cover all his debts and leave enough for a new start. "Why are you telling me this, Jim?" A long pause. "Just information, buddy. Just information." After the conversation, Winston couldn't concentrate on his work. The number spun around in his head like an annoying melody. $400,000. More than he had earned in the last 3 years combined. When he got home that evening, he found Sabrina in the kitchen preparing dinner. They hadn't eaten together in weeks, but tonight she had set 2 plates on the table. "I thought we should talk like civilized people," she said, without looking up from the stove. "About what?" "Practical things. How we're going to live while the divorce is going through. Who's going to pay the bills? Who's going to take care of the house?" Winston sat down at the table watching his wife. In profile, she still looked young, and he remembered meeting her 20 years ago at the same bank where she worked now. Back then, she was just a nice girl working as a teller, and he was a promising contractor with big plans. "I'll have to sell the equipment," he said. "The excavator, the truck. That will cover several months of house payments." Sabrina nodded, handing him a plate of chicken and vegetables. "What about the church contract?" "We'll finish it in a month. The money will go to pay off debts to suppliers and workers." They ate in relative silence, and Winston caught himself thinking that it almost resembled a normal family dinner. Almost. "Sabrina," he began cautiously, "do you remember when we took out life insurance a few years ago?" She looked up. "Of course." James insisted it was a sensible precaution. "And how much was it?" $400,000 for each of us." She put down her fork. "What, are you going to cancel the policy?" "Just curious." Sabrina looked at him searchingly. "Winston, we both know our marriage is over, but that doesn't mean I wish you ill. I just want us to part amicably." "I know," he said, but his mind was already forming completely different thoughts. Saturday was supposed to be a day of rest, but Winston couldn't find peace. He paced around the house, trying to read, watch TV, do chores, but his thoughts kept returning to the same thing. $400,000. Sabrina had gone away on business and was due back in the evening. Left alone, Winston sat down at the computer and began searching for information about accidents in the mountains. The statistics were impressive. Every year, dozens of tourists and climbers died in Colorado. Falls from cliffs, avalanches, hypothermia, disorientation. He opened a map of the area around Mount Valley. Eagle Rock was 10 miles from the city, a popular destination for day hikes. It was about 300 feet high and offered a picturesque view of the valley. Dozens of people went there every weekend. Winston closed his laptop and went to the kitchen for a beer. What was he doing? What was he thinking? But he couldn't get the numbers out of his head. $400,000 would solve all his problems. There would be no divorce because there would be no wife who wanted a divorce. There would be no division of property because there would be no one to claim half. The phone rang. Sabrina. "Hi, I'm going to be late. I ran into Carol and we decided to go to the movies." Okay, he replied mechanically. Don't wait up for me. I'll see you late tonight. After the call, Winston went out to the backyard and sat on the porch steps. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful evening, as beautiful as the day 5 years ago when he and Sabrina climbed Eagle Rock to celebrate the signing of the largest contract in his company's history. The memory suddenly took on a new hue. At that time, there was only one couple with children at the top. The trail was deserted, and the rock itself was high enough that a fall would be fatal. My God, Winston whispered, realizing the direction his thoughts were taking, but he couldn't stop. It was a clear, cool Sunday morning, perfect for a hike in the mountains. Sabrina was studying her weekly schedule in her diary over breakfast. You know, Winston said casually, what if we go to Eagle Rock today, like in the old days? Sabrina looked up in surprise. Really? We haven't gone hiking in 2 years? Maybe it will help us talk, calmly, without pressure. He tried to make his voice sound natural. You know, discuss everything like adults. Sabrina hesitated for a moment. I don't know, Winston. After everything that's happened between us, that's exactly why. Maybe we should try to part as friends, not enemies. Something in his tone convinced her. Or perhaps she also felt the need for a normal conversation, without lawyers and documents. Okay, she said finally, but it won't change my plans about the divorce. I understand. They packed quickly, a backpack with water and a light snack, comfortable shoes, jackets in case the weather changed. It took 20 minutes to get to the trailhead, and they were silent the whole time, each lost in their own thoughts. The parking lot at the foot of the mountain was almost empty, just their SUV and an old pickup truck with fishing stickers. The trail to Eagle Rock was well marked but challenging enough to deter casual hikers. The climb took an hour and a half. Sabrina led the way, as always, and Winston followed behind her, trying to control his growing inner tension. With each step, the thoughts in his head became clearer. $400,000. No divorce, no division of property. Start over. Do you remember the first time we came here? Sabrina asked, stopping to rest near a large boulder. Of course. You were terrified of heights, but you made it to the top anyway. She smiled, the first genuine smile she had given in weeks. And you said the view was worth it. You were right. Yes, Winston agreed, feeling something tighten in his chest. The last part of the trail was the steepest. Sabrina climbed slowly, holding on to rocks and tree roots. Winston followed her, and one thought pulsed in his head. Now or never. The top of Eagle Rock was a relatively flat area the size of a large room. It was surrounded by forest on 3 sides and dropped away into the valley on the 4th. The view was truly breathtaking. Endless mountains covered with coniferous forests and a ribbon of river far below. God, I forgot how beautiful it is here. Sabrina sighed as she approached the edge. Winston stood next to her. They were alone, just as he had expected. It was Sunday. The weather was clear, but it was late enough that most of the tourists had already gone down. Sabrina, he began, I want you to know that I'm not angry with you for the divorce. She looked at him in surprise. Really? Really? You're right. We've become strangers, and maybe that's for the best. Sabrina turned away to look at the view, and there was something sad and peaceful in her profile at the same time. You know, I thought we'd be together forever, when we were building the house, planning for the future. Yes, said Winston, taking a step closer. I thought so too. The moment was perfect. Sabrina stood 2 feet from the edge, admiring the view. Below, 300 feet away, sharp rocks were visible. One push, one moment, and all their problems would be over. Winston raised his hands. $400,000, he whispered. What? Sabrina began to turn around. At that moment, Winston pushed her in the back with both hands. Sabrina screamed. trying to regain her balance, but it was too late. Her hands caught on the edge of the cliff for a moment, her eyes wide with horror and confusion, and then she disappeared into the abyss. Winston stood at the edge, breathing heavily, and looked down. Far below, on the rocks, lay a motionless figure in a red jacket. For a moment, he couldn't move, realizing what he had just done. Then his instinct for self-preservation took over, and he began to act on a premeditated plan. Winston took out his phone and dialed 911. Emergency services? We have an accident at Eagle Rock. My wife fell off the cliff. She's not responding. Please send help immediately. His voice was shaking, and it wasn't an act. Adrenaline and the realization of what he had done were taking their toll. Sir, stay on the line. We are sending a rescue team. Can you reach the victim? No, it's too high. She's lying on the rocks below. My God, there's so much blood. Sir, stay calm. Help will be there in 20 minutes. Winston turned off the phone and sat down on the ground away from the edge. His hands were shaking. His mouth was dry. He had just killed his wife, the woman he had lived with for 18 years, for money. But there was no other way. There wasn't. He heard the sirens of the rescue vehicles 15 minutes later. The sound of the helicopter echoed between the rocks as the Jefferson County rescue team approached Eagle Rock. Winston sat on the ground 50 feet from the edge of the cliff, his head in his hands, looking like someone in shock. It didn't take any acting skills. He was genuinely shaking from the adrenaline and the realization of what he had just done. The first to arrive at the scene was a paramedic named Rick Morrison. An experienced man in his 40s, he had seen enough accidents in the mountains to assess the situation immediately. He approached Winston first. Sir, are you okay? Are you injured? No, I'm fine, Winston managed to say. But my wife, my God, there's so much blood. How did this happen? We were taking pictures at the edge. Sabrina took a step back to get a better shot, and the ground crumbled beneath her. I tried to grab her, but I didn't make it in time. Morrison nodded, making notes, then cautiously approached the edge of the cliff and looked down. What he saw made him wince. A woman in a red jacket lay on a ledge about 200 feet below, her body bent unnaturally. Dispatcher, this is Morrison. We're going to need a full team with climbing gear. The victim is on a rock ledge and may have multiple injuries. While the rescuers were preparing the equipment for the descent, a deputy from the sheriff's department, Deputy Lisa Wilson, approached Winston. Mr. Haynes, I need to ask you a few questions about what happened. Winston nodded, trying to look like a man who was struggling to control himself. What time did you arrive here? Around 2 in the afternoon. It took us an hour and a half to climb up. And there was no one else here? When we arrived, no one. Maybe someone was here earlier, but we didn't see anyone. Wilson wrote down the answers. Tell me exactly what happened. Winston took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. The story he had rehearsed all the way here. We came to talk about the divorce. Sabrina filed the papers last week, and I thought if we discussed everything calmly in a beautiful place. He paused, feigning emotion. She wanted to take some photos as a memento. I offered to take her picture at the edge. She was stepping back to fit in the frame of the phone, and suddenly, the ground just gave way beneath her feet. Do you have a phone? Photos? Winston's heart skipped a beat, but he quickly regained his composure. She was taking pictures on her phone. Mine's in the car. Wilson nodded. We'll check her phone when we get her out of there. 30 minutes later, rescuer Jack Coleman rappelled down to where Sabrina lay. His voice sounded tense over the radio. We have a critical situation, but she's alive. Her pulse is weak, but it's there. Multiple fractures, possible head trauma. Need immediate evacuation to the hospital. Winston felt the world suddenly spin before his eyes. Alive. Sabrina was alive. Oh my God, he whispered, and this time he didn't need to fake his emotions. She's alive? Yes, sir, Morrison replied. We're doing everything we can. The next half hour turned into the chaos of a rescue operation. Sabrina was lifted onto a special stretcher, her neck and spine immobilized, and IVs attached. Winston could see her face, pale, bruised, but she was breathing. A medical helicopter transported her to St. Mary's Regional Hospital in Denver. Winston followed in his car, accompanied by Deputy Sheriff Wilson. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was filled with the familiar atmosphere of controlled chaos. Sabrina was immediately taken for examination, while Winston remained in the waiting room, filling out medical forms and answering additional questions from the police. Detective Michael Thornton arrived an hour later. A tall man with graying hair and attentive eyes, he introduced himself as the lead accident investigator for the county. "Mr. Haynes, I'm sorry to hear about your wife. How is she feeling?" "The doctors aren't saying anything yet. They're running tests." Winston rubbed his face with his hands. "It was an accident, Detective. A terrible, stupid accident." "I understand. We just need to record all the details for the report. Tell me again what happened." Winston repeated his version of events, trying not to deviate from what he had said earlier. Thornton listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You said your wife wanted to take a picture?" "Yes. She always loved photographing beautiful places." "And she was stepping back to get a better shot?" "Exactly. I even told her to be careful, but she—" Winston paused, feigning painful recollection. "Mr. Haynes, forgive me for asking a personal question, but Deputy Sheriff Wilson said you mentioned a divorce?" "Yes. Sabrina filed for it last week. I was hoping we could talk things through calmly and find a compromise." "And how did the conversation go?" "We didn't really talk. We just went upstairs. She wanted to take some pictures, and then this happened." Thornton nodded sympathetically. "I understand. We'll finish the formalities tomorrow when you've had a chance to recover." Around 8 o'clock in the evening, a woman in a white coat approached Winston. Dr. Emily Carter, a neurologist, looked tired after a long day of surgeries. "Mr. Haynes, I'm Dr. Carter. Your wife is in stable condition. How is she? Will she be okay?" "She's alive, that's the most important thing. She has multiple rib fractures, a broken right arm and leg, but those injuries will heal. I'm more concerned about the traumatic brain injury." Winston's heart stopped. "How serious is it?" "Severe. She has extensive brain contusions and swelling. We performed surgery to reduce the intracranial pressure, but the next 48 hours will be critical." "What if she survives?" Dr. Carter paused before answering. "Mr. Haynes, I have to be honest with you. Even if your wife recovers physically, a traumatic brain injury of this severity can have serious consequences. There may be memory problems, personality changes, motor impairments." "Memory problems?" "Yes. In some cases, patients lose their memories of events prior to the injury. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's permanent." Winston felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. If Sabrina didn't remember what had happened on the rock, "Can I see her?" "Of course, but not for long. She's still unconscious." The intensive care unit was filled with medical equipment. Sabrina lay in a hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored her breathing and heartbeat. Her head was bandaged, her face swollen from bruises. Winston sat down next to her and took her hand. Her skin was cool, but he could feel a faint pulse at her wrist. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and this time the words came from deep within his soul. "God, forgive me." He sat there until late into the night, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the monotonous sounds of the machines. A mass of conflicting thoughts and emotions swirled in his head. On the one hand, he felt relief that she was alive. Despite everything that had happened between them, Sabrina had been a part of his life for almost 2 decades. The thought of him killing her was unbearable. On the other hand, her survival created new problems. What if she remembered what had really happened? What if she told the police that he had pushed her? But the doctor had mentioned memory loss. Perhaps Sabrina would never remember those last moments on Eagle Rock. Perhaps his version of an accident would remain the only one. The next day, Winston returned to the hospital early in the morning. Dr. Carter greeted him with cautiously optimistic news. Her condition has stabilized. The swelling in her brain has begun to subside. I think she'll regain consciousness soon. And her memory? It's too early to say, but be prepared for the possibility that she may not remember many things. She may not recognize you right away. Around noon, Sabrina opened her eyes. At first, she stared at the ceiling, blinking, then slowly turned her head and saw Winston. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse and weak. "You're in the hospital, dear. You fell. But everything will be fine now." Sabrina tried to sit up, but Winston gently stopped her. "Don't move yet. You have broken ribs." "I don't remember." She closed her eyes, trying to concentrate. "What happened?" "We went to Eagle Rock. You wanted to take a picture and got too close to the edge. The ground crumbled." Sabrina looked at him for a long time, her eyes filled with confusion. "Eagle Rock? We went there?" "Yes, yesterday. Don't you remember?" She shook her head, grimacing in pain. "I don't remember yesterday. The last thing I remember is us having dinner at home. You said something about a church contract." "That was 3 days ago." Winston felt the tension ease a little. "The doctor said it's normal after a head injury. Your memory may come back gradually. Or it may not come back," added Dr. Carter, entering the room. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Haynes?" "My head hurts, and my whole body." "It will pass. You're lucky to be alive after such a fall." After the doctor left, Sabrina looked at Winston again. "It's strange. I remember we talked about divorce, but I don't remember us going anywhere together." Winston gently took her hand. "I suggested we talk about everything calmly. I thought a beautiful place would help us find common ground. And what did we decide? We didn't really have time to talk. You wanted to take pictures and... Yes, I understand." Sabrina closed her eyes. "Winston, I'm tired. Can I sleep?" "Of course. Get some rest." Leaving the room, Winston felt a strange mixture of relief and new anxiety. Sabrina didn't remember what happened on the cliff. That was good. But she was alive, and sooner or later, her memory might return. Detective Thornton was waiting for him in the hallway. "How's your wife?" "She's awake, but she doesn't remember what happened. That often happens with head injuries." Thornton made a note in his notebook. "Mr. Haynes, our team examined the scene. The edge of the cliff is indeed quite fragile in that spot. Rocks could easily have broken off under a person's weight." "So it was an accident?" "Everything points to that. But we will need to talk to your wife again when she is fully conscious." "Of course, but the doctor says her memory may not return." "Then your statement remains the only source of information about what happened." After the detective left, Winston returned to his wife's room. Through the glass door, he could see her sleeping, hooked up to monitors. Alive, but broken. Alive, but with no memory. He couldn't collect the $400,000 insurance policy. Sabrina was alive. But divorce was now impossible. What husband divorces a wife who nearly died? And her memory problems meant that she wouldn't be able to work at the bank, at least for a while. Everything had changed, but nothing had been resolved. The financial problems remained, but now they were compounded by medical bills. The marriage was formally intact, but it had become a burden of caring for a sick wife. Winston realized that he was in an even more hopeless situation than before the incident on the cliff. And the worst thing was that he knew he was capable of murder. He knew that if he had the opportunity to finish what he had started, he could do it again. 2 weeks had passed since the incident on Eagle Rock. Sabrina had been transferred from intensive care to a regular ward, and her condition was gradually improving. The fractures were healing, the abrasions were healing, but the memory problems remained. Every day, Winston came to the hospital after work. He brought flowers, magazines, and home-cooked meals prepared by their neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. He played the role of the devoted husband so convincingly that sometimes he began to believe in the sincerity of his own feelings. "How's the construction going?" Sabrina asked on Monday when he brought her noodle soup. "We're finishing the church. Another week and it will be ready." "And then what?" Winston hesitated. Then there was nothing. No new contracts, no prospects, only debts and medical bills that grew every day. "Something will turn up," he said evasively. Sabrina looked at him searchingly. In her eyes, he saw a glimmer of the sharp mind that had always distinguished her. "Winston, I remember filing for divorce, but I don't remember why. Did we fight?" "We didn't fight. We just grew apart. You said you couldn't live with the uncertainty anymore." "Uncertainty?" "Because of my financial problems. You were afraid we would lose the house." Sabrina nodded slowly. "Yes, that sounds familiar, but I don't remember the details." "It doesn't matter now. The main thing is that you're getting better." "Winston," she took his hand, "I want you to know that what happened has changed my attitude toward many things. Life is too short to waste on quarrels." Winston felt a pang of conscience. "What do you mean?" "I want to withdraw the divorce petition. When I get out of here, we'll try to work things out." Wednesday began with an alarming phone call from Dr. Carter. "Mr. Haynes, there have been some interesting changes in your wife. Her memory is starting to return." Winston gripped the receiver tighter. "What exactly does she remember?" "Fragments. She remembers going to the doctor a week before the fall. She remembers talking to you about going to the mountains. This is a hopeful sign. It means the recovery process is underway." "What about the day it happened?" "Not yet. But medicine knows of cases where memories of traumatic events return completely, even weeks later." After the conversation, Winston couldn't work. He sat in his office, staring blankly at the documents for the church project. But all he could see was Sabrina's face at the moment she realized she was falling. The look of horror and bewilderment. What if she did remember? That evening at the hospital, Sabrina greeted him with a smile. "Hi, honey. Guess what? Today I remembered our conversation about the hike." The blood in Winston's veins turned to ice. "What conversation?" "You suggested we go to Eagle Rock to talk about our problems. I remember I didn't want to at first, but you said we needed to discuss everything calmly, like adults." "Yes, I remember." Winston tried to make his voice sound natural. "I also remember that you looked strange, tense, as if you were hiding something. I was worried about our conversation. I didn't want to argue." Sabrina nodded, but a shadow of doubt remained in her eyes. "Dr. Carter says I'll be able to go home soon, maybe next week." "That's wonderful," Winston said, but inside he felt cold. Winston didn't sleep that night. He lay in his empty bedroom at home on Maple Street and thought about Sabrina's memory returning. What if she remembered not only the events leading up to the fall, but the moment itself? What if she remembered his hands on her back? By morning, he had made up his mind. Thursday was rainy. Winston arrived at the hospital later than usual, around 9 in the evening. The ward was quiet. Visiting hours were officially over, but the nurses knew him as a devoted husband and usually allowed him to stay. "How is she today?" he asked the nurse on duty. "Better. Her memory continues to return. Today she remembered how you were going on a hike." Winston's heart skipped a beat. "What exactly does she remember?" "She said you were looking for something in the closet. A backpack, I think. She also mentioned that you spent a long time studying a map on the computer." Winston nodded, trying to look calm, and walked into his wife's room. Sabrina was awake, looking out the window at the rainy night. "Hi," she said, turning to him. "I remembered a lot today." "Doctor." "Carter says that's a very good sign." "Yes," she paused. Winston, why were you studying the map so carefully? We knew the way to Eagle Rock. I wanted to check the weather and trail conditions. After rains, there are sometimes landslides. I see. But there was uncertainty in her voice. Winston sat down in a chair next to the bed. The ward was quiet, only the monotonous beeping of the monitors breaking the silence. Sabrina, I have to tell you something. While you were unconscious, I thought a lot about us, about what happened between us. And? I don't want a divorce. I want us to try to fix things. She turned to him, her eyes softening. Me too. When you're lying here, you realize what's important and what's not. Winston felt a new pang of guilt, but forced himself to continue. Can you ask the nurse for something? I want to stay with you longer today. They allow you to stay late as it is. But if you want... Sabrina pressed the call button. You can ask for an extra pillow. A few minutes later, the night nurse, Cynthia Brown, looked into the room. She was a young woman who had been working at the hospital for about a year. Can I help you? Can I have an extra pillow and maybe another blanket? Of course, I'll bring them right away. The nurse left, and Winston was alone with his wife. He got up and went to the window, looking at the lights of the city below. You know what's strange? Sabrina said suddenly. What? I'm starting to remember our conversation before the trip, and I had a feeling that you were hiding something from me. Winston slowly turned to her. What do you mean? I'm not sure. You just weren't your usual self. You were more decisive, as if you had already made some important decision. The nurse's footsteps could be heard in the hallway as she returned with the pillow. Winston looked at his wife, lying defenseless in the hospital bed, connected to the machines that were keeping her alive. Mrs. Haynes, here's your pillow. Cynthia entered the room. Thank you. Could you bring me a glass of water? My throat is dry. Of course, right away. The nurse left again. Only Winston, Sabrina, and the quiet beeping of the life support monitors remained in the room. Winston? Sabrina looked at him with sudden clarity in her eyes. I remember something else. What? I remember you standing behind me on the cliff. Very close. And I remember your voice. You said something just before I fell. The world around Winston slowed down. What did I say? Something about money. About $400,000. Sabrina tried to sit up, and understanding came into her eyes. Terrible, clear understanding. Oh my God! Winston, what did you do? He didn't answer. He couldn't answer. He just stood there and looked at her, the woman who remembered the truth. You pushed me. You wanted to kill me for the insurance money. The nurse's footsteps could be heard in the hallway again. 30 more seconds and she would be entering the room. 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine the rest of her life. Sabrina reached for the nurse call button, but Winston was faster. He grabbed her hand, preventing her from reaching the button. Sabrina, please listen to me. Let go of me! She tried to break free, but she was still weak from her injury. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. In a second, the nurse would enter and see them struggling. Sabrina would tell her everything. She would tell the police. He would be arrested. Winston looked at the ventilator even though Sabrina was breathing on her own, and the main heart rate monitor was next to the bed. One power cord. I'm sorry, he whispered and pulled the plug out of the socket. The monitors went dark. The room fell silent. What are you doing? Sabrina tried to reach for the emergency call button, but Winston grabbed her hand. This should have happened 2 weeks ago, he said quietly. Help! Sabrina screamed. Help! Winston pressed his hand over her mouth and with his other hand found the oxygen tube and disconnected it from the machine. Sabrina struggled under his hands, her eyes filled with terror, but she was still too weak and he was too desperate. Mrs. Haynes, I brought some water. The nurse's voice came from just outside the door. Winston let go of his wife and quickly turned the monitors back on, but it was too late. Sabrina was gasping for air, her face turning blue from lack of oxygen. Nurse Cynthia entered the room with a plastic cup in her hand and froze when she saw what was happening. "Oh my God! What happened?" "I don't know." Winston stepped back from the bed. The machine suddenly shut down, and then she started choking. Cynthia rushed to the bed, checking the equipment connections while pressing the emergency call button. "Code blue in room 314. Code blue in room 314. Sabrina was still trying to breathe, but her movements were getting weaker. She was looking straight at Winston, and in her eyes he saw not only physical pain, but also an understanding of what was happening. The resuscitation team rushed into the room. Dr. Carter was among them, her face tense and focused. "What happened?" "The equipment shut down," Cynthia explained. "When I came in, she was already suffocating." "Strange. These machines aren't supposed to just shut down." Dr. Carter checked Sabrina's pulse. "She's in cardiac arrest. Let's start resuscitation." For the next 10 minutes, the medical team fought for Sabrina's life. Winston stood in the corner of the room, watching their attempts to revive her. Part of him hoped they wouldn't succeed. Another part prayed that she would survive. At 9:47 p.m., Dr. Carter stopped resuscitation efforts. Time of death, 9:47 p.m. The silence in the room was deafening. Winston stared at his wife's motionless body and felt the reality of what was happening slowly sink in. Sabrina was dead. He had killed her, this time for good. "Mr. Haynes?" Dr. Carter touched his shoulder gently. "I'm so sorry. I don't understand." She was getting better. After such severe head injuries, anything can happen. Cerebral circulation, blood clots, secondary complications. She sighed. Sometimes the body just can't cope with the effects of the initial trauma. "So it's related to the fall?" "Most likely, yes. We'll perform an autopsy to determine the exact cause of death, but initially it appears to be the result of injuries sustained in the fall." An hour later, Detective Thornton arrived at the hospital. He found Winston in the waiting room, sitting with a blank stare and a cup of cold coffee. "Mr. Haynes, my condolences. Dr. Carter told me what happened." "Thank you, Detective. I need to ask you a few questions. It's standard procedure in cases of sudden death." Winston nodded. "Tell me what happened tonight." "I came in as usual after work. Sabrina looked fine. We talked. Then the nurse went out to get some water, and when she came back..." Winston paused, feigning emotional shock. "The nurse said the equipment had been disconnected from the power when she returned." "Yes, all the monitors were off. I didn't understand what was happening. I tried to turn them back on, but it was too late." Thornton wrote down the answers in his notebook. "Did your wife say anything before she took a turn for the worse?" Winston paused. "She said her memory was starting to come back. She remembered our conversation before the trip." "And that's all?" "Yes. Then the nurse left, and a few minutes later she started having trouble breathing." "Mr. Haynes, I must warn you that given the circumstances of the death, there will be a full investigation. An autopsy, analysis of the medical equipment, interviews with the staff." "Of course, I understand. One more question. Did your wife mention any concerns about her safety?" Winston looked at the detective with surprise that he didn't have to feign. "Concerns? No, never. Why do you ask?" "Just a standard question. Forget about it." But Thornton didn't look like the kind of man who would simply forget questions. At midnight, Winston finally got home. The house on Maple Street greeted him with silence and darkness. He turned on the light in the living room and sat down in the same chair where, 2 weeks ago, Sabrina had told him about the divorce. Now she was dead, officially from complications of a traumatic brain injury, in reality from his hands. Winston took out his phone and dialed James's number. "Jim, it's me." "Vin, it's late. What's up?" "Sabrina died an hour ago in the hospital." A long silence. "Damn. I'm sorry, buddy. What did she die of?" Complications from a head injury. The doctors say it happens. My condolences, Vin. I know how hard it is, despite all your problems. Yeah. Winston paused. Jim, when can we file the insurance claim? Another pause, shorter this time. Usually after the funeral and the death certificate is issued, a few weeks. Okay. Vin, do you need support? I can come over. No, thanks. I need to be alone. But was everything smooth? Detective questions about security, a nurse who noticed the disconnected equipment, Sabrina's recovering memory. Too many variables, too many ways things could have gone wrong. Winston realized that the murder was only the beginning. Now, he had to live with the consequences, pretend to be a grieving widower, answer questions from the police, and hope that the truth would never come out. Detective Michael Thornton sat in his office at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, studying the case file on Sabrina Haynes' death. Monday morning began with the autopsy report, and some of the details made him frown. Coroner Dr. Robert Steinberg was an experienced professional, but even he acknowledged that this was an unusual case. The official cause of death is cardiac arrest due to cerebral hypoxia, he explained to Thornton over the phone. But there are nuances. What exactly? The injuries from the fall were serious, but not fatal. She could definitely have survived and recovered, at least partially. Death was caused by acute asphyxia, so she suffocated? Yes. But what's strange is that the level of medication in her blood was normal. No signs of overdose or allergic reactions. Just a sudden cessation of breathing. Thornton hung up and opened the file with the medical staff's statements. Most of it was standard, but the report from night nurse Cynthia Brown caught his attention. When I entered the room, Mr. Haynes was standing next to the bed, and the equipment was unplugged. He said the machines suddenly turned off by themselves. Thornton underlined that line. Machines don't turn themselves off, especially not all at once. On Tuesday morning, Thornton arrived at the hospital to talk to the staff. Tom Ryder, the head of technical services, showed him room 314, where Sabrina had died. We checked all the equipment after the incident, Ryder explained. No technical malfunctions. The machines are working properly. What could cause them to shut down simultaneously? Only one thing, if someone deliberately pulled the cords out of the sockets. Thornton examined the room more closely. The marks on the floor were barely visible, but the detective's trained eye noticed them. Scratches on the linoleum near the outlets, as if the plugs had been pulled out hastily. Tom, are there security cameras in the hallways? Of course. Would you like to see the recordings? Definitely. The footage from the hallway camera was grainy, but clear enough. Thornton saw Winston enter the room at 8:45 p.m., then the nurse leave at 9:15 p.m. and return at 9:19 p.m. 4 minutes. Enough time to disconnect the equipment. But the most interesting thing was Winston's behavior. The recording shows him leaving the room immediately after the nurse arrives, standing in the hallway, pacing nervously, then returning when the commotion begins. Strange behavior for a man whose wife is dying, Thornton muttered. The next stop was the Haynes construction office. Maria Gonzalez met the detective with eyes red from crying. Such a tragedy, detective. Poor Mr. Haynes, first the accident and now this. Tell me about the company's financial situation. Maria lowered her eyes. Not very good, to be honest. Mr. Haynes didn't talk about it openly, but I saw the bills. A lot of debt. How did he react to the divorce? Very painfully. He said that if they sold the house, he would have to declare bankruptcy. Did he ever mention his wife's insurance? Maria thought for a moment. Not to me. But I remember Mr. Rivera from the insurance company calling. They discussed something. James Rivera received Thornton in his office on Main Street with obvious nervousness. This is a terrible story about Sabrina, he began. Winston is completely devastated. Mr. Rivera, are you the Haynes family's insurance agent? Yes, I wrote their policies several years ago. Tell me about Sabrina Haynes' life insurance. James opened a file on his computer. A $400,000 policy. It was taken out 5 years ago. That's a large sum for people with average incomes. Winston was doing better then, and Sabrina was earning good money at the bank. When was the last time Winston inquired about the details of the policy? James hesitated too long. I don't remember exactly. Mr. Rivera, this is an investigation. I need the truth. He called the Friday before last. He asked about the payout amount. Was that after his wife filed for divorce? Yes. And what exactly did he say? James nervously adjusted his tie. He said that financial problems were getting him down, that the divorce would be the final blow. Did he mention any plans to solve his problems? Detective, I don't think Winston is capable of... Answer the question. He asked in what cases the insurance would be paid out. I explained that it would be in the event of death due to accident or illness. And was he interested in that? The silence stretched on. Finally, James nodded. Yes, very interested. Wednesday brought new information. Thornton received detailed testimony from nurse Cynthia Brown, who was the last person to see Sabrina alive. When I entered the room with water, Mrs. Haynes was lying with her eyes wide open and trying to say something, but she was having a very hard time breathing. And Mr. Haynes? He was standing by the window. He looked alarmed, but he wasn't panicking. I found that strange. Why strange? Usually relatives in such situations scream, call for help, try to help, but he just stood there. What else did you notice? Cynthia paused. Mrs. Haynes was trying to say something when I gave her the injection, something like, he, me, but she couldn't finish. He, me, what? I don't know. She lost consciousness. By Thursday, Thornton had enough information to summon Winston for an official interview. They met in the detective's office at 9 in the morning. Winston looked tired and depressed, but he remained calm. Mr. Haynes, thank you for coming. I need to clarify a few details. Of course. You said your wife wanted to take a photo at Eagle Rock? Yes, but we didn't find any photos taken that day on her phone. Winston felt the first pang of anxiety. Maybe she didn't have time to take the pictures? Possibly. Thornton opened a folder of documents. Now, about the events at the hospital. The nurse says the equipment was disconnected from the power supply when she returned. Yes, I saw the monitors go out. And you tried to turn them back on? Of course, but I don't know anything about medical equipment. Mr. Haynes, the technicians checked the machines. They couldn't have turned off by themselves. Someone pulled the cords out of the sockets. Winston was silent, feeling the walls closing in on him. In addition, Thornton continued, your friend James Rivera told us about your conversation regarding your wife's insurance. Quite an interesting conversation. I was just curious. Mr. Haynes, I have a motive. $400,000 in insurance. I have the opportunity. You were alone with your wife in the hospital. I have the evidence. Deliberately disconnected equipment. Winston looked at the detective, realizing the game was over. And one more thing, Thornton added. We found your fingerprints on the medical equipment plugs. It was a lie, but an effective one. Winston no longer had the strength to pretend. She remembered, he said quietly. What exactly? She remembered what happened on the cliff. She realized I pushed her. Winston buried his head in his hands. She was going to tell the nurse. And you decided to stop her. I didn't plan it. It just happened. She looked at me, and I knew she knew the truth. Thornton turned on the tape recorder. Winston Haynes, do you admit to the murder of your wife, Sabrina Haynes? A long silence. Then, barely audible, yes. Tell me what happened at Eagle Rock. And Winston told everything. About financial problems, about insurance, about how a friend had given him the idea to kill her, about how he lured Sabrina to the rock and pushed her, about how he finished the job at the hospital. Winston Haynes's arrest became the top news story in Mount Valley. The small town hadn't seen such a high-profile crime in many years. Neighbors couldn't believe that the quiet building contractor was capable of murdering his wife. The trial took place 6 months later. The prosecutor presented ironclad evidence of premeditated murder for the purpose of obtaining insurance money. The defense tried to cite temporary insanity due to financial stress, but the jury did not believe it. James Rivera received a 2-year suspended sentence for aiding and abetting. His advice on insurance was considered incitement to commit a crime. Winston Haynes was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The house on Maple Street was sold to pay off debts. The construction company Haynes Construction went bankrupt. $400,000 in insurance remained unpaid. Insurance companies do not pay out to beneficiaries who have committed murder themselves. Life in Mount Valley gradually returned to normal, but Eagle Rock became a place that locals avoided for a long time. Too much pain was associated with these beautiful views.